Where are you from, Lester?
I'm from Hong Kong.
What did you do in Hong Kong?
I worked in a fashion retail shop.
What's the main meal of the day?
The main meal of the day would be dinner. A lot of people say it's breakfast, but I don't really have time for that. I like to sleep in a bit.
Is it better to eat one meal or several small meals?
I believe it's better to have several small meals because people say it's healthier to have several small meals.
Do you usually eat alone?
I usually eat alone because most of my family members would be working.
Do you think people eat too much fast food?
I do think people eat too much fast food these days, including myself.
Do you prefer eating at home or at restaurants?
I prefer eating in restaurants because I can try different food, which is if I eat at home, normally I only have Chinese food.
So here is our candidate Lester giving his part 1 response to the IELTS test. Now, first thing you'll notice about Lester's response is that the speaking time is quite short. It comes in at about a minute, and you're expected to talk for 45 minutes. So length is definitely going to be a problem, because if you look at the first criteria, fluency, you're expected to talk at length. Now, of course, your score is not calculated just for one part of the test, but this is definitely a problem as far as fluency goes. Okay, now the other aspect of fluency is that you need to be able to talk without stopping to think what to say. Now, Lester can usually do that, but we see here where he talks about restaurants that he needs to stop and self-correct himself. It doesn't happen too often, but here is one example of that. Now, the other aspect is coherency, being able to make yourself understood to the listener. And what Lester says is very coherent, because when we look at what he says, words like, but I don't really have time for that, referring to breakfast, using pronouns like this is called referencing, and he makes good use of that, even though there's only one example of him doing it here. Now, if we move on to look at vocabulary or lexis, that is a big problem. If we look at the category 7 for lexical resources, it says uses vocabulary resources flexibly to discuss a variety of topics. Now, Lester copies a lot of the words that he uses straight from the question. For example, here, what's the main meal of the day? The main meal of the day would be dinner. See, these words all come from the question. Or is it better to eat one meal or several small meals? And again, Lester uses a lot of the same words that are used from the question. He doesn't attempt to use his own words. So the examiner cannot give you a good vocabulary score if you simply use the words that are used in the question. It just can't happen. The only example of, as they say here, less common vocabulary is here, where Lester talks about liking to sleep in a bit. This sleep in, and also a bit. I would say this is an example of less common vocabulary being used. But for the rest, even though it's very accurate, I wouldn't call it less common. Go on to look at the grammar. For a good score in grammar, you need to be able to use a range of complex structures. For a 6, you should be able to use a good mix of simple and complex structures. So let's look at what Lester says. Some simple sentences are, for example, I'm from Hong Kong, I worked in a fashion and retail shop, I like to sleep a bit, sleep in a bit. And compound sentences would be a lot of people say it's breakfast, but I don't really have time for that. So here we have two sentences. A lot of people say it's breakfast, and I don't really have time for that, joined with the conjunction but. That's what a compound sentence is. So we have these two clauses that can exist by themselves. And he also uses some complex sentences where he says, I believe it's better to have several small meals because people say it's better. People say it's healthier. Where we have the sentence, I believe it's better to have several small meals, and then people say it's better. This is a dependent clause because this cannot exist by itself. And then he also uses a conditional sentence. If I eat at home, normally I only have Chinese food. Now, as far as pronunciation goes, it seems Lester has spent quite a lot of time living in Australia. His pronunciation is quite good. And he uses stress effectively. And he also breaks up his answers into meaningful units. For example, a lot of people say it's breakfast. There's a pause just before breakfast. But I don't really have time for that. I like to sleep in a bit. So there's a proper pause between each what we call chunk of speech. He doesn't just give one chunk. He pauses and breaks the chunks, or breaks the whole sentence into chunks, meaningful units. But overall, too short. When you are doing the answers to even just part one, which is the simplest part, there are really three aspects to your answer. You should, of course, answer the question directly, put your answer in the beginning, but then after that, give a reason why. Explain your answer, and then give more detail about the reason, or give an example. And we don't see Lester doing any of that.